Hearing will come to order. Let me welcome the members and witnesses and guests to this first hearing in this Congress of the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee. I certainly appreciate all the members who have chosen to join this subcommittee. And among other benefits, we'll have the former chair and former ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Sanchez and Mr. Miller, as part of our body. But I'm really looking forward to the chance to working in partnership with the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin. He and I started working together on cyber issues in 2003 as part of the Select Homeland Security Committee on the Cyber Subcommittee of that body, and have worked together on this committee and on the Intelligence Committee basically ever since. So I look forward to what we can accomplish together for the country's security in the next 2 years. One of the first things that one notices is the name of the subcommittee has changed. And I think that is to better match what our charge is. We are to look out in the future and help see that the United States is prepared to deal with those national security challenges that are still emerging, that we're still learning about, things such as terrorism and cyber warfare. We are also charged with nurturing emerging capability that can meet those and other threats. And the jurisdiction of the subcommittees has been changed to reflect so we can better focus on cyber and these other challenges. Of course, any emerging threat presents new challenges on policy, legal authority, budgeting, such as we've witnessed, for example, since 9/11. And today, in the field of cyber, we want to start by asking really a fairly basic, but I think important question, and that is, what is the role of the Department of Defense in defending the country in cyberspace? If a formation of planes or some hostile acting ships came barreling towards a factory or refinery in the U.S., I think most of us have a pretty good idea of what we would expect from the Department of Defense. They may try to identify who it is, divert them over to another area. They may even go so far as to shoot them down. But the bottom line is we expect our military to protect us from threats that we cannot handle on our own. But what do we expect, or what should we expect, if a bunch of malicious packets or potentially malicious packets come barreling at us or come barreling at the same facilities in cyberspace? I'm not sure we have a good answer to that. And if we figure out what we expect, then the question is, can the government do what we expect? Does it have the ability and the authorization to do it? I don't expect that we're going to get definitive answers to those questions today, but I do think we need to be serious and diligent about pursuing those answers, because the threat is serious and it's growing in numbers and sophistication. Yesterday at the Intelligence Committee hearing, I asked D&I Clapper, Director Panetta, FBI Director Mueller about how serious the threats in cyberspace were as a matter of national security. Each of them responded they thought it was, in fact, very serious. Clapper said, quote, "The threat is increasing in scope and scale, and its impact is difficult to overstate." So we know that cyber is a new domain of vandalism, of crime, of espionage, and yes, even warfare, but I'm afraid the country is not very well equipped to deal with any of those challenges. As we look for solutions, we have to be smart and careful and true to our values, but I believe we need to act to improve our security, and I appreciate the witnesses who are here today to help guide us on that path. But first I would yield to the distinguished gentleman from Rhode Island, the ranking member, for any comments he'd like to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As this is our subcommittee's first hearing of the 112th Congress, I just wanted to take a moment to congratulate you on your chairmanship and to say how much I very much look forward to working with you again. As you rightly pointed out, we worked on many of these issues together from our time in the Homeland Security Committee to our time as we've served on this committee and as well as the House Intelligence Committee. So our paths keep crossing in a very positive way. and we've enjoyed a very productive partnership in the past, and I know we'll continue with our work on this subcommittee as well. So congratulations to you. In 2007, as Chair of the Homeland Security Subcommittee on Emerging Threats, Cybersecurity, and Science and Technology, I conducted a detailed and thorough examination of cyber threats to our power grid after tests conducted at Idaho National Labs, known as Aurora, became public. At that time, industry representatives from NERC misled or were inaccurate about their testimony to the Homeland Security Committee about their efforts to address these threats in the private sector. Now, we called on them, we called them on it, and they retracted their statements, but the experience illustrates how difficult it can be to require and ensure security when it comes to critical infrastructure. Since then, threats to our critical infrastructure have only grown, with news reports suggesting that there is interest by malicious actors in exploiting vulnerabilities in the U.S. power grid and other critical infrastructure. The Federal agencies have taken steps to reduce these vulnerabilities, but I have to say how I am afraid that many in industry and in government still fail to appreciate the urgency of this threat. Since I began working on this issue, I have been disappointed by the overall lack of serious response and commitment to this issue, and I still believe America is vulnerable to a cyber attack against the electric grid that would cause severe damage not only to our critical infrastructure, but also to our economy and the welfare of our citizens. Because of this concern, last Congress, I posed this question to the heads of all of our military services. If our civilian power system is vulnerable, what is being done to protect our numerous military bases that rely on them to operate? Well, the answers were disturbing, but not surprising. Vice Admiral Barry McCullough, head of the Navy's 10th Fleet, testified that, I quote, "These systems are very vulnerable to attack," end quote, noting that much of the power and water systems for our military bases are served by single sources and have only very limited backup capabilities. With an attack on a power station potentially requiring weeks or even months to recover from, our bases could face serious problems maintaining operational status. A recent report from the Department of Energy's Inspector General found that despite years of concern and hand-wringing by those who are aware of the threats, not much has been done to increase protection of these civilian systems. The report also faults both Federal regulators for not implementing the adequate security standards, cybersecurity standards. But if you ask industry, you will find out that there is no actual requirement to do what the government wants. The regulators don't have any actual ability to regulate when they see a problem, despite being fully aware of the tremendous risks that face our nation. Now, if everyone is aware of the threat, both DOD and our civilian power sector, it appears that the tragedy of the Commons has ruled that no one has been willing or able to address it. At the House Intelligence Committee's annual open meeting yesterday, Director Panetta testified that cyber threats to our critical infrastructure had the potential to be the next Pearl Harbor, and I agree, and remain unconvinced that we have the abilities or the authorities to stop a large-scale cyber attack. To this end, last year I introduced legislation to coordinate our national cybersecurity policies for the protection of our Federal networks as well as our critical infrastructure. And while we had success with an amendment in the House Defense Authorization Measure, many know that we were forced to remove that language during conference. Let me just say, Mr. Chairman, that I look forward to working with you to move forward again this year and finally begin to address these critical vulnerabilities. Today, I am anxious to hear from our panel, especially Mr. McCauley from NERC, and ask what has changed since 2007. Are we still as vulnerable today as we were then? And I, for one, believe that the answer is yes. I fear that little has changed other than the acceleration of the threat and the growth of our vulnerability. With that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to our witnesses' testimony. I want to thank our witnesses for being here, and I will yield back.
I thank the gentleman. And now we'll turn to our witnesses. And let me say, first of all, I appreciate each of y'all's written statement. Without objection, they will be made part of the full record. But I thought each of you did a very good job in laying out a number of issues. I know I learned from each of them, so I appreciate the effort you put into that. With us today is Dr. Sherry Flieger, Director of Research from the Institute of Information Infrastructure Protection, headquartered at Dartmouth. Mr. Jerry Colley, Chief Executive Officer of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC. and Mr. Gregory Nojime, Senior Counsel, Center for Democracy and Technology. Pretty good? Okay, good. Thank you all for being here. We will try to move out smartly today. I don't think we'll have votes for a little bit, and I'd like to get everybody a chance to ask questions before those votes. So, as I say, your full statement will be made part of the record if you'd like to summarize it, and then we'll turn to questions. Dr. Flieger, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Langevin, members of the subcommittee, and guests. Thank you for inviting me here. I was asked to talk about the economics of cybersecurity, and I've organized my response based on the three big questions that you asked me. So the first one is, what are the significant challenges that face us? And I see three big challenges. The first is the diverse and distributed ownership of the cyber infrastructure, which makes it difficult to apply traditional approaches for security because there are so many different pieces, and many of those pieces have been developed without security in mind. They are not always security is not always the biggest motivator for making money for the providers of those pieces. The second is appeal as a criminal tool. Criminals can use the cyber infrastructure to perpetrate their crimes more broadly, more quickly, and more anonymously than they could before. And the third is, and this perhaps has the most relevance to the Defense Department, the difficulty in reacting to emergent behavior. Many aberrant cyber-based behaviors are emergent in that it takes a long time to figure out exactly what's going on, understanding the cause and effect, and selecting an appropriate reaction. And when the cause isn't certain and the possible responses have life-threatening or diplomatic implications, the decision makers have to reduce the uncertainty surrounding cause and effect. So I've identified three policy, legal, economic, and technical challenges. The first is misaligned incentives. Most of the providers are in business to make money, not necessarily to provide security. And so many organizations prefer just to wait for cyber attacks to happen and clean up the mess, or they rely on what's sometimes called free riding or herd immunity, where they let other people implement the security and the people who don't implement the security still get some benefit. And in addition to that, the bad outcomes don't always affect the organization lacking security or don't affect them for very long. So for instance, their stock prices might go down, but then they eventually pop back up again. So there's little incentive for them to take a long-term security view. The second is a need for diversity. Technological diversity leads to more secure networks and systems, but because of a variety of things, including economic reasons, training, access, and even chance, the technology is actually quite uniform, more than we would expect. And finally, security is often incompatible with organizational culture and goals. So many people who use our networks are paid to get their jobs done, and they often see security not as an enabler, but as an inhibitor. So you see lots of cases of people turning off the security in order to get their jobs done, or neglecting to do things like set the security properly. So what should the government do? I suggest 5 things. The first is to address cyber attacks the way other unwelcome behaviors are addressed. Our current reliance on convenience surveys for information about cyber attack trends can be misleading, and we need more careful sampling and more consistent solicitation of data. The government should incentivize or require better breach, fraud, and abuse reporting, and data about the nature and number of cyber attacks should be reported consistently each year so that sensible trend data can form the basis for effective actions. It may be more useful to capture data in smaller ways, in various ways for various purposes, and then good economic models informed by these representative, consistent data can improve our general understanding not only of the cyber risk, but of the cyber risk relative to other kinds of risk. Second, I recommend that liability statutes cover cyber technology. When lack of car safety was made more visible in the 1960s, the government responded by making automobile companies more liable for their unsafe practices and products. Similarly, I think a combination of manufacturer liability and economic constructs like insurance could encourage more secure product design and implementation. The third is insist on good systems engineering. Use the government's purchasing power in two important ways. First, refuse to continue to deal with system providers whose products and services are demonstrably insecure, unsafe, or undependable. The data gathered in this process can inform subsequent technology decisions so that errors made in earlier products are less likely to occur in later ones. Especially in cybersecurity, we see the same problems appearing over and over again. Secondly, insist on solid, up-to-date formal arguments describing why the systems are secure and dependable. These arguments are used in other domains like nuclear power plant safety and could easily be applied to cybersecurity. And suppliers' formal arguments could be woven into the system integrators' security arguments to show that supply chain issues have been addressed with appropriate levels of care and confidence. The fourth suggestion is to provide incentives to encourage good security hygiene. Incentives like tax incentives and insurance discounts can speed implementation of demonstrably more security technology, and the incentives should also include rewards for speedy correction of security problems and punishments for lax attention to such problems. Finally, encourage multidisciplinary research. Many security failures occur not because there's no solution, but because the solution hasn't been applied, or because designers fail to include the user's perspective when designing the technology. Research involving behavioral science and behavioral economics can improve the security and dependability of the nation's cyber infrastructure in two ways. In the short term, it can improve adoption rates for security technology, thereby reducing the attack surface against which malicious actors aim. And in the longer term, it can lead to a more resilient cyber infrastructure that users are eager to use correctly and safely. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Colley.
Good morning, Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Langevin, members of the subcommittee, and fellow panelists. My name is Jerry Colley, and referring to Ranking Member Langevin's comments on the performance of NERC in the past, I will point out that I am the new President and CEO of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and I also serve as the Chairman of the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council. I'm a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, a former officer in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I have a master's degree in nuclear engineering from the University of Maryland, and I've devoted over 30 years to working toward the safety and reliability of our nuclear and electric industries, including in 2003 serving as the lead investigator for the 2003 Northeast blackout. I have with me also today NERC's Chief Security Officer, Mark Weatherford, behind me, who until recently served as the Chief Information Security Officer for the State of California and previously served 26 years in the U.S. Navy as an Information Security Officer. NERC is a nonprofit corporation that was founded in 1968 to develop voluntary operating and planning standards for the owners and operators of the North American bulk power system. In 2007, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission designated NERC as the Electric Reliability Organization in the United States in accordance with the Energy Policy Act of 2005. As a result, our standards, including cybersecurity standards, became enforceable at that time. To my knowledge, they are the only mandatory cyber standards among the various critical infrastructures in North America. As CEO of the organization charged with overseeing reliability and security of the North American grid, I am deeply concerned about the changing risk landscape from conventional risks such as extreme weather and equipment failures to emerging new risks where we are left to imagine scenarios that might occur and prepare to avoid or mitigate the consequences, some of which could be more severe than we've previously experienced. I am most concerned about physical and cyber attacks intended to disable elements of the power grid or deny specific electricity to specific targets such as government and business centers, military installations, or other infrastructures. These threats differ from conventional risks in that they result from intentional actions by adversaries and are simply not random failures or acts of nature. It's difficult to address such rapidly evolving risks solely with a traditional regulatory model that relies mainly on mandatory standards, regulations, and directives. The defensive barriers mandated by our standards do make it more difficult for those seeking to do harm to the grid, but alone they may not be completely sufficient in stopping the determined efforts of the adaptable adversaries supported by nation-states or organized terrorist groups. The most effective approach against such adversaries is to apply resiliency principles as outlined in the National Infrastructure Advisory Council report on the grid delivered to the White House in October 2010. I was fortunate to serve on that council with a number of industry CEOs. Resiliency requires proactive readiness for whatever may come our way. It includes robustness, the ability to minimize consequences in real time, the ability to restore essential services, the ability to adapt and learn. Examples of the NIAC team's recommendations include: 1, a national response plan that clarifies the roles and responsibilities between industry and government; 2, improving the sharing of actionable information by government regarding threats and vulnerabilities; 3, cost recovery for security investments driven by national policy; and 4, a strategy on spare equipment with long lead times such as electric power transformers. NERC is moving forward with a number of our own actions to complement our mandatory SIP standards and provide enhanced resilience to the grid, including partnering with the Department of Energy and the National Institute of Standards and Technology to develop comprehensive cybersecurity risk management guides for the entire electric system, from the meter to the bulk power system. Making actionable information available to the industry is a priority for NERC. We worked with DOD, DHS, and other agencies in 2010 to issue high-quality alerts to the industry on the Aurora mitigation, the Stuxnet malware, and a VPN tunneling vulnerability. We are developing a North American cybersecurity exercise to prepare for and test a national response plan. In recent meetings at the U.S. NORTHCOM and the Pentagon, we have begun collaborating with DOD on assessing worst-case scenarios and developing case studies at critical military installations to ensure that essential requirements for national security are being addressed. We are engaged with the DOE national laboratories in opportunities to apply the expertise of the Federal Government in enhancing the cybersecurity of our grid. In 2010, we started conducting on-site security sufficiency reviews at utilities, and will continue that program in 2011. And we are working with vendors and industry to demonstrate enhanced physical security of our systems. The emerging challenges we faced are difficult, but not intractable. I believe we can and must take decisive actions through partnership between industry and government to meet these challenges, and I thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Mr. Nojum.
Thank you, Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Langevin, and members of the subcommittee. Thanks for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Center for Democracy and Technology about cybersecurity and the role of DOD. CDT is a nonprofit, nonpartisan civil liberties organization dedicated to keeping the Internet open, innovative, and free. The United States faces significant cybersecurity threats. While the need to act is clear, it is essential that we take a nuanced, incremental approach that recognizes distinct roles for DOD, the Department of Homeland Security, and the private sector. Generally speaking, DOD entities should be responsible for military systems, DHS for civilian government systems, and the private sector should monitor its own unclassified systems. We ask that you keep a key distinction in mind. Policy toward government systems can be much more prescriptive than policy toward private systems. The characteristics that have made the Internet successful, openness, decentralization, and user control, may be put at risk if heavy-handed cybersecurity measures are applied to all critical infrastructure. In the case of critical infrastructures, one size does not fit all. When DHS and private sector efforts to secure civilian government and private systems fall short, it is tempting to conclude that Cyber Command and NSA should lead outside the .mil domain. But they operate in a culture of secrecy for entirely legitimate reasons. that would hamper civilian cybersecurity efforts that depend on public trust and corporate participation. Instead, expertise and resources of Cyber Command and NSA must be leveraged to help DHS with its cybersecurity mission. More robust information sharing from the private sector to the government and vice versa is one way to leverage resources, but policymakers must proceed carefully to ensure that information sharing does not devolve into de facto surveillance through ongoing or routine disclosure of private communications to the government. When he unveiled the White House Cyberspace Policy Review, President Obama correctly emphasized that the pursuit of cybersecurity must not include governmental monitoring of private sector networks or Internet traffic. That is one of the overriding civil liberties priorities in the cybersecurity arena. Another is ensuring the free flow of information, even in a cybersecurity emergency. Empowering the government to shut down or limit Internet traffic over private systems could have unintended effects, including discouraging network operators from sharing cybersecurity information that they ought to share out of fear that that information would be used to shut them down. They know better than the government when elements of their systems need to be isolated. Despite the value of anonymity on the Internet, some have proposed sweeping identification mandates, even a passport for using the Internet. Identification and authentication will likely play a significant role in securing critical infrastructure. We don't dispute that. However, they should be applied judiciously to specific high-value targets like classified military networks and to high-risk activities, and should allow for multiple identification solutions. Finally, you should resist proposals that would damage cybersecurity by making communications less secure. We are concerned about proposals to extend communications assistance for law enforcement design mandates to communications applications to facilitate electronic surveillance, as is being sought by the FBI, because it could weaken communication security. Privacy and security cannot be viewed as a zero-sum game. Measures intended to increase communication security need not threaten privacy and indeed can enhance it. We look forward to working with the subcommittee to identify and promote these win-win measures.
Great. Thank you. I look forward to the same thing. I'm going to reserve my questions and let other members have a chance, and I would yield first 5 minutes to Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and panel, thank you. It's interesting we've got Dr. Flieger on one end and Dr. Nojum on the other, because many of the things that Dr. Flieger was proposing to do fly in the face of what Dr. Nojum was saying in terms of some of the prescriptive things that would happen. Playing off the Chairman's original comments about the analogy between a physical attack on America and the response that the Federal Government spoken, it would be the military, of course, but the Federal Government's response to that is pretty clear. Trying to look at those solutions in cyber, given that the cyber attack happens in a blink of an eye or less, and the warnings aren't nearly as easy to discern, obviously couches the problem that we've got. Who out there among the think tank groups are proposing solutions to that? In other words, each of you brought, maybe that was your mandate, brought narrow-focused solutions to the issues, but is there a group out there that's looking at the broader issue of how does it, what is the Federal Government's role? DOD and NSA with respect to the mil and Homeland Security, and then nobody on everything else, as Dr. Nojum concerned. Is that a rational way to continue down this path?
I don't think that anybody's out there proposing that there's a silver bullet. I think that most people who are engaged in this endeavor all recognize that there needs to be a number of incremental steps taken. The thought that there is a silver bullet, I think, flies in the face of the kinds of risks that we're facing. We're going to have a situation where industry and the government cooperate, and sometimes very closely, in order to deal with these risks. We've suggested not that industry has to stand alone when those packets are coming toward them, but that there is a very strong role that the government can play in helping out. It includes information sharing. It includes the sharing of attack signatures that will help the private industry identify the attack as it comes in.
And that's the sharing of information that Dr. Flieger was saying ought to be done on a real-time basis as opposed to ad hoc every once in a while. Is that, am I understanding between those two comments?
I don't think it necessarily has to be real time, but it has to be regular. As the threats change, we need to know what the changes look like.
No, not trying to put words in your mouth, but did I understand what you just said in relation to what her comment was in terms of one of the solutions is to have a better way to gather the scope of the problem on a regular basis as opposed to an ad hoc basis?
No, we agree that there has to be a lot of information sharing, and that
how do you put that in place, that quote unquote requirement in place, without terrifying folks about your other comments that we're taking over the internet, all the other things that internet nonsense is going out there right now as a result of some of the comments the President made and misinterpretation of those. I mean, how do we bridge that gap?
I don't think you have to have a world where communications traffic that is private to private traffic and is coming over an internet backbone has to be shared with the government. I don't think that anybody's proposing that world. I think that what we do need is a world where if private industry sees anomalies, they can share information about those anomalies with government agencies that need to act on them, and that can happen quickly and it can happen in near real time.
Let me, before my time runs out, Mr. Colley, help me understand the scope of your national test on the security exercise. Is that just with respect to the electricity grid that you're talking about doing, or is that broader infrastructure than just electricity? Congressman, this year the exercise will be fairly limited in scope. We're looking to pull in all of the key players in the industry in terms of participating in the exercise and demonstrate the communications and emergency scenarios that we might see. We do have interfaces with Homeland Security, DOD, and Department of Energy and others who will participate in that exercise. One of the challenges that we're looking to try to resolve during such an emergency is what are the relationships between industry and government, and how do we crystallize what those relationships should be and who's in charge and how that works. So we're hoping this exercise in the fall of this year will help answer and maybe clarify what additional questions need to be answered with that regard. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're back.
Thank the gentleman. Ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, to the panel, I want to thank you for your testimony today. This is obviously fascinating and a very important work. If I could, Mr. Colley, I'd like to start with you. First of all, thank you for refreshing my memory. Just the record mentioning that you're new on the job at NERC as the chair, and thank you for the wealth of experience you bring to the job, and I certainly look forward to working with you in that role. Let me ask you, touched on some of the things in your testimony about what's changed since 2007, but for the point of our conversation, would you highlight again some of those things that have changed over the last few years? And I still am of the opinion that NERC and FERC really still lack the authority to direct all power utilities to follow cybersecurity regulations. So I'd like you to touch on that as well. And actually, how do you know that the government's guidance is being followed or that we're actually secure?
Thank you, Ranking Member Langevin. The industry has evolved quite a bit. As you know, the issue of cyber and physical security is relatively new to the industry compared to the 100-year history of the industry. I've had the opportunity in the past year to go out and meet a number of CEOs in most of the industry, and I believe that the awareness and the commitment is there that perhaps may not have been there before, but certainly has been elevated, and I feel we have the support of the industry. The standards that we had have been in transition, so I think we've evolved and improved the standards. We just recently approved a new standard with a bright line criteria in terms of what are the critical assets that need to be covered by our cybersecurity standards. And we're in the process of adopting NIST controls into our standards, and that work continues. I believe at this point that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has full and adequate authority to direct us to do any additional standards or modifications to the standards that would be required to protect the security of the grid. In terms of
would you agree, though, that FERC doesn't have the kind of robust authority that, say, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has when dealing with threats or things that need to be directed be done?
Yes, sir. I was going to get to the point where I think there may be a gap. I think that does exist. So in addition to the standards, we have the ability to put actionable information to the industry. We've improved that process. So where I think we have a gap, a very narrow gap that's been narrowed with our activities over the last couple of years, is in an emergency situation. If there's an imminent threat to the grid, at this point we have the ability to put that information out, but not to produce a mandatory requirement in a short amount of time. In that arena, I do support expanded authorities for the Federal Government. Could be FERC or it could be another agency, but I believe there is an opportunity. It's an authority I would like to have. For an emergency, imminent threat to the grid, action must be taken. I would caution, however, that the grid is a very complex machine. Ordering certain actions can have adverse consequences, even to the point of taking down the grid, so that involving NERC in that process and putting the directive in a form of a conservative action, conservative position, but not telling operators how to operate the system would be most effective.
Thank you. And I would certainly look forward to working with you on closing that gap. Mr. Chairman, if you could, would you does NERC work right now with DOD identifying threats to the electric infrastructure critical to our military readiness? I know you touched on that in your testimony, but for the purpose of the record, would you expand on that?
Yes, Ranking Member Langevin, we have just begun that recently, and we're in the process of ramping that up. The first thing we're going to do is look to develop a design basis scenario. I think the industry has a perspective of what are the worst case scenarios that can happen from their own risk management perspective. But when we look at national threats, obviously those risks tend to be more widespread and potentially more devastating. So we're in the process of beginning to develop a national cyber and physical security attack on the grid, and what is the worst case scenario that we could work from. That will drive things like the extent of our emergency plans, do we need spare equipment, and those kinds of questions. The second piece, just to be brief, is working on an installation by installation basis in terms of, are there adequate redundancies and procedures in place to ensure that each critical installation will have power supply, and if it is taken out, that we would have the capability to restore power very quickly.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Gibson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the panel today. Very informative testimony all across the board. I actually want to pursue the experimentation question just a little bit further. So I'm understanding that this is the first time, sir, that your organization is participating in this type of exercise? In 2011? Yes, sir.
If you're referring to the national exercise?
Yes, secure grid exercise.
We have done training and exercises historically for preparations for hurricanes and earthquakes and known types of risks. We have participated most recently in Cyberstorm 3 and the previous versions of Cyberstorm. So we have participated in exercises. What we're proposing to do this year is in our exercise is to get greater involvement by industry rather than a sampling of industry, engage our entire communications infrastructure. We have the ability to communicate with the operating companies directly, and rather than having a government-driven exercise where we bring a few of them in. I want this to be industry-driven, where the government folks can participate with us.
I'm trying to, where I'm driving is, I'm trying to get an appreciation for just how secure our electrical grid is, and I'm trying to get an understanding of the exercise that's going to try to draw conclusions about that. So you mentioned you're still drawing up the design for the exercise. What principles are you using to ensure you're sampling geographically and with enough depth that you're going to be able to draw significant conclusions from your exercise?
Congressman Gibson, I think we're talking probably several different things. So in terms of the actually evolving security of the grid, I believe we're enhancing that continuously. We have standards for firewalls and protections and access controls and those kinds of things. So the actual security is progressing in terms of continuously improving. The challenge is, what's the worst thing that could happen? And we're in the process of working with Department of Defense to postulate some potential extreme events, like take down major cities, take down major oil refineries or military installations. Those scenarios, we have not run those in the past, and we're developing those as new this year. We currently have the ability to communicate directly and have robust communications with industry folks, but now with this new scale of a scenario we've not seen before, we will test that and demonstrate our ability to meet that challenge.
And one final question on this same topic. As private sector, as research and development is done on the possibility of moving beyond copper for transmission, are you comfortable with that there's enough collaboration that you'll be able to make assessments as far as security going forward?
We have very open dialogue with national labs and other agencies in government that we're trying to take advantage of every technology that will be useful and practical and cost-effective for implementing in the private sector.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member. I commend you for holding this hearing and look forward to joining you in the hard work that will be necessary to secure the cyber domain. There is an emerging consensus that we need to clear jurisdictional distinctions between military and civilian cybersecurity efforts. Just as the military does not police our streets, it should not police our civilian cyber infrastructure. But we must ensure that the armed forces will have the necessary tools to prosecute and defend the country from cyber warfare. One note on private sector regulation. As we draw these fine jurisdictional distinctions, Congress should establish hard regulatory requirements, not just soft suggestions of voluntary security measures, to ensure the security of our private sector technology infrastructure. We do not merely recommend that airlines maintain the highest standards of safety and reliability. Likewise, we must not merely recommend that American industry implement state-of-the-art best practices to ensure cybersecurity. We must require it, and there should be penalties when those requirements are not heeded. My first question I would ask each of our panelists, what is the first question, the essential question for determining whether any given cyber threat should be the purview of civilian or military cybersecurity authorities?
That's a difficult question to answer because the military often uses private sector networks to accomplish things. And the threats to national security can be economic, they could be espionage, they could be a variety of things. So I'm not sure that I think it would be a case-by-case answer rather than a one-size-fits-all answer, which I think reinforces what Mr. Nojheim said, that there's no silver bullet for security, and it's very difficult, I think, to I think you need to look at the threat models and use the threat models to decide when the military should step in and when it shouldn't.
Thank you.
Congressman, first I would agree that mandatory requirements and enforceability are one element in establishing an adequate defense, and we have those standards and are looking to continue to improve those for the electric grid. I think to answer your question directly, it's the responsibility of the asset and information owners to protect their assets and their information. And I think those are divided into government and private sector assets and information. However, the reality is we are very much intertwined. Military bases and systems depend on electricity, so we're bound together not only in the information world but also in the electric world. So I think it's important to complement that clear line of responsibility and accountability for securing our own systems to make sure that our actions are also complementary and helpful to each other. And so I think there are opportunities for the military to assist us in information awareness and when we are under attack and maybe don't know it, and vice versa for us to ensure that we've done everything we can to provide reliable electric service.
I agree with both of the other panelists. I think that one thing to keep in mind is that you often won't know what precisely was the source of the threat, what was the source of the problem. So then it becomes difficult to say who is responsible to respond to that threat. But I think it is easier to say that everybody should be securing their own systems or the systems for which they are responsible, and to add that if I'm securing my system and I learn about information that would help Mr. Colley secure his system, I need to have a way to share it. And that is, I think, where a lot of productive work can be done.
Thank you. Mr. Nojheim, in the physical world, there are clear differences of capability and role between civilian law enforcement and the armed forces. The military wields superior firepower, specializes in destruction instead of arrest or investigation, and is subject to less restrictive rules of engagement. What are or should be the equivalent differences of role and capability between civilian and military cybersecurity authorities?
You know, and some of the capabilities are going to have to be similar. So, for example, say the National Security Agency has the ability to distinguish what is an attack signature that could threaten of malware that could threaten a communication system. That information is useful not just to the NSA, not just to Cyber Command, not just to the Department of Homeland Security, but to many people who are trying to secure information systems. The point that I'm trying to get across is that while we talk about, and I have talked about, having distinct roles for each of these entities, we can maintain that distinction by relying on other activity that will help secure all networks better. One of those activities is information sharing, which I've talked about, and another is the sharing of expertise. There may be expertise within the military and at the National Security Agency that would be helpful to the Department of Defense. And there's already a mechanism to allow for the sharing of some of that information.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, and for the panel being here today. I think when we look at this 21st century battlefield, it is definitely different from what we encountered in the 20th century. And of course, it is multidimensional, multispatial, and of course, the cyber realm does bring some interesting challenges. So my question, going back to my time in the military, we always had this thing called mission essential vulnerable areas, and we always sat down and looked at what was our high value target list, the things that we knew that we needed to protect from our adversaries and our enemies. So my question is, in your assessment, What systems should be considered critical to national security? And under what framework should the government and the Department of Defense in particular provide for the security of private networks, both to those deemed critical to national security and to a wider user base? I'll open that up to the panel. And subject to your response, I'll yield back to the Chairman.
Congressman, I would take this on from the perspective of the electric grid in relationship to military. We have taken steps to identify what are the critical assets within the grid. We've approved a standard requiring companies to identify those. Obviously, nuclear plants are essential, large generation, high voltage transmission that serves as the backbone of the grid, a black start generation that allows us to reboot the system if it needs to be done, and our larger control center. So we're in the process. We've required that. What that may not get to, however, is the relationship with security, the military installations, which, as I mentioned, the initiative that we've started with DOD is to identify if there's, besides our own electric priorities, what are the priorities of the military that we need to take a look at as well. And then at that point, it becomes a decision between the electric company servicing that facility and the military base in terms of what additional steps would be needed. I would add one more aspect that I hadn't had a chance to mention. There are going to be some actions and threats that are beyond the capability of the industry to cope with. And an example, much has been said about a nuclear blast 400 kilometers in the sky creating an EMP event that takes down the grid. And in my suggesting we need to understand the relationship between government and industry in resolving issues, that's a poster child for that, because I think the industry would say that's a government issue if we have a nuclear blast going off over our skies in the homeland. Obviously, we would be expected to take some actions in terms of protecting and hardening the grid, but those issues need to be worked out further.
Then the follow-on question is, do you think we have a clear line of delineation between the responsibilities of, the government, DOD, and the private sector?
No, sir, not to the extent needed for clarity of responsibility facing these new threats. I think the collaboration, consultation has been good, but I think it's based on ad hoc relationships and not clear lines of responsibility and authority.
I'd like to use two examples to address your question. The first is there is a model that seems to be working that the Defense Department is already using called the Defense Industrial Base, where collaboratively the major contractors come together to share their cyber experiences and to share the things that they've done in order to address any kind of cyber problems. That might be a good model for extending in some way. And the roles there, I think, are fluid, because I think collaboratively the Defense Industrial Base acts to help the Defense Department, but at the same time makes clear what their individual goals are as private enterprise. The other thing is that I would encourage the Defense Department to think more about prevention rather than reaction to cyber attacks. And let me use an example. I was at a meeting a couple of years ago where someone from DARPA was talking about funding a system where for example, the whole communication system in the U.S. could be viewed on one screen, and you could watch as a cyber event unfolded that one part of the country goes down, then another, then another. The problem with that example is that it might not have been a cyber attack. It might have been that all the phone companies are buying their switches from the same vendor. There's a flaw in the switches, and they all happen to be going down because some system problem was percolating through the system. So that's what I meant in my testimony about the difficulties of emergent behavior and the risks of making assumptions. And so it's very hard in those cases to decide not only what's going on, but what is the appropriate thing to do to react. Therefore, I think it makes a lot more sense to look from a preventive point of view at things like our critical infrastructure and look at more diversity, look at redundancy, look at ways of making sure that if we do have some sort of attack, we can come back up quickly, or at least in some manner that enables the Defense Department as well as private enterprise to function while we figure out what's really happening and apply fixes.
I would just add that there is a list of critical infrastructure key resources, Tier 1, Tier 2 list. DHS has prepared it. It's based on assessments as to what would happen if these were destroyed or rendered inoperative in terms of casualties, whether people would have to evacuate areas, what would be the damage to national security. So there's already been a lot of thinking about what needs to be protected. We don't have to recreate the wheel on that score.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. You provide a broad range, and that's appreciated. I don't know whether you would feel prepared to answer this question specifically, but I'm wondering about interagency collaboration, coordination. One of the things that we experienced here on the Armed Services Committee a number of years ago was sort of our shock that, in fact, I guess I would say the Pentagon and the State Department didn't really talk to each other to the extent that they should, and that we really weren't looking at a whole-of-government approach, if you will. Can you apply that to the issues that we're addressing here in terms of cybersecurity? How would you assess the extent to which that is a kind of a working, I guess it's a work in progress in many ways, but where are we in that as you look upon how we best deal in an interagency way on this issue?
Well, there are some formal and some informal things going on. There was, for a while, an InfoSec Research Council where different agencies funding cybersecurity research had representatives get together periodically and share what they were doing and coordinate. There are more formal things like the Department of Commerce now has an Internet Policy Task Force that's looking across the government. But you're absolutely right that a lot more needs to be done. There needs to be a lot more regular interaction at high levels across the different departments.
Any area particular that you would seek to improve specifically if that we could focus on that?
Well, certainly discussions between defense and commerce and between defense and state. Those are probably the two I would pick.
Congresswoman, with respect to the electric system, we've had very collegial consultation with a variety of agencies, and they're very helpful. I think if we are challenged, it's just the confusion over leadership and the relationships between the different organizations and the relationships between government and private sector. So they're collegial. We're getting work done. We're learning. They're learning from us. We're learning from them. But it's not clear what the delineation of responsibilities, who's in charge, those kinds of questions. We're making do with what we have today.
Who's in charge? That's a big question. We got that. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Nutt. Did you want to comment on that as well?
I would just
your
say
perspective?
that there's some cooperation, some communication, and that it's starting to get better, and it needs to go further.
Can I just ask you a little bit about the labor force as it relates to this highly complex STEM area of education and science and technology? Clearly, we're not where we want to be generally in the country as it is in terms of encouraging young people to go into the field. Again, can you assess sort of the labor force and those people who are migrating to these careers and to this area, and what should we be doing even in terms of preparing our youngest children, I think, in having the ability to work in this area, since we know that as I'm just getting introduced to this topic and our concern that state actors make us very vulnerable, and we obviously need to be providing that expertise to our young people as well. Any thoughts, ideas? Where's the labor
in
force?
the electric industry, we're seeing an influx of talent. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that kids will go where the jobs are, and we're seeing very bright influx, and we're also focused on training. I think we do have a gap that we're working on, which is to elevate the credentials, the professional credentials of our security, physical and cybersecurity folks. So I think it's major improvements in the last couple of years, lots of new talent coming in, but a long ways to go as well.
Yeah.
In many cases, the people who provide cybersecurity expertise don't do only that, especially in small businesses. And so we are having a workshop at the end of April at Georgia Tech to look at the demand to help inform what the supply should look like. And we're inviting people from government and industry together to tell us what their demand looks like and what some of the problems are, so that we can make some recommendations about what the supply activities should look like.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one question. One of the issues we have, not just what I'm going to ask if it fits into the cyber strategy that we all should have as a country, is the issue of translating a lot of different languages. Is that an issue when we're talking about cybersecurity, where we have, whether they're state actors or a decentralized, Al-Qaeda type, where these folks are working from a different language than the English language and trying to attack our systems? Is this an issue for us? Is this something that we need to be aware of? Because clearly, I know as far as the private sector goes, you're talking about Mandarin and Farsi and being able to have enough Americans able to speak these languages, to write and read in these languages for our corporate interests as well as our governmental interests. I just wondered, as I'm sitting here listening, is that something that we should be concerned about not having, on top of what Ms. Davis was just saying, the workforce capable of helping us address this problem? And I'll let you answer and yield back the balance of my time when they're done.
Congressman, from an electric perspective, I don't view that as a priority at this time. For the North America, all of our information exchange is done in English, including in Quebec and where French is the language, but the electric grid operations are purely English. So we treat anything that's not in English as suspect to start with. So it's not really an interpretation question for us. It hasn't come up to our attention at this point.
I think at one level, bad code is bad code, and it's not really a question of whether it's English language or Spanish or another language. I think that the issue about needing people to speak in multiple languages comes up mostly in terms of prosecuting wrongdoers and being able to understand what people are saying who are perpetrating the crimes.
No, I know at one point we had an issue with a lot of the intelligence we were getting. We weren't able to translate a lot of the, kind of preparing for attacks against us and whatnot. We weren't able to do that. So I just want to throw that out there if that's something we need to continue to look at.
And that's still the case with a lot of the intelligence we get. We don't have the resources to translate it. So I thank the gentleman. Dr. Flieger, you talked about incentives in your statement. It has been suggested to me that with proper incentives we can elevate general cybersecurity that would take care of roughly 80% of the problems that are going through cyberspace. You think that's about right?
Well, I don't know if it's 70%, 80%, but 2 days ago, Arbor Networks revealed the results of a survey that they did of network engineers, and the top problem that the network engineers talked about was non-technical factors being one of the most significant obstacles to reducing mitigation time. A lot of that has to do with there being a lack of incentives for the people maintaining the networks to pay more attention to security, the lack of users to pay more attention to security, And so because a lot of these non-technical problems loom large, I think that 80% number is probably close. I mean, if you look at things like the causes of a lot of typical problems, we see the same things over and over again. People don't change things from the default settings. They don't understand how to install security software. If there were incentives to encourage people to do the right thing, what I called in my testimony good hygiene, it won't completely solve the problem, but it could eliminate a lot of these things that we see that recur that shouldn't be happening anymore. We should know better by now.
Do you know of any organization that has actually run the numbers, by which I mean, say, this incentive for this tax provision or this, whatever it is, will have this consequence in the real world? Because businesses are calculating cost-benefit every day. How much is it going to cost? What's the benefit I get? And that cost-benefit has to align up for them to take additional actions. Has anybody run the numbers to kind of get more specifics on it?
There are some researchers who have done some economic models that suggest which incentives might be the most effective, but I haven't seen a lot that use real-world numbers, in part because it's hard to get good data. Yeah. So there are some first steps, but it would be really helpful if business would work with some of the modelers so that the models reflect the realities of the business trade-offs.
Okay. Mr. Colley, especially in your written statement, you made reference to the fact that private industry is always going to be at least a step behind in identifying some of the most sophisticated threats that go through cyberspace. I mean, just assume, if you will, that you can take care of 80% by good hygiene. We still have 20% that are the more sophisticated, difficult threats to deal with. And so as from what you've said earlier today, I take it in that area you think there needs to be more government assistance of some sort for that kind of upper tier.
Yes, Chairman, Mr. Chairman, that's why I think we need a dual strategy. The ranking member Langevin has suggested we need firmer regulations and standards, and I agree with that because it provides a baseline of the expected mandatory requirements. But facing a dynamic, ever-evolving adversary, sitting still with a fixed barriers is going to be very difficult. So having a robust relationship with government intelligence agencies, which we're beginning to develop, take quick information and be able to turn it into actions that the industry can take is essential. So let's treat it like it's a dynamic, ongoing war, and it's not a fence we put around the systems. And I think that's where we need the help from the federal government.
Let me ask you this. There's been lots of talk about a smart grid. To me, that indicates that there are more access points on the grid to the Internet. Does that not increase our vulnerability or potential vulnerability of the electricity grid? Mr.
Chairman, it does introduce additional risks, additional entry points, and it's incumbent upon the industry and government, I think, in partnership to work out a sufficient set of security requirements for smart grid and also for the vendors to deliver devices and systems that build in the security as a major objective from the start, not as an add-on later down the road.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Nojam, I think Mr. Colley a while ago kind of used the EMP example as a big catastrophic sort of event that would require government direct intervention. And I guess what I'm wondering with you is, do you, set EMP aside, but do you think there could be a situation where the cyber event is of such a magnitude as to overwhelm perhaps private ability to deal with it, and that direct government action would be appropriate? Or, as I think you've kind of indicated in your testimony, is it always, as far as direct responsibility, it's DOD for DOD, DHS for .gov, and all of .com is on its own?
So I just if I gave the impression that all of .com is on its own, I didn't mean to do that. Because what I did say in the testimony, at least a few times, were some measures that ought to be taken to help .com defend itself. As for a catastrophic event that the private person couldn't deal with, I'd need to just talk a little bit more and understand a little bit more about what that event would be. So, for example, some people have said that maybe the government ought to have authority to order the shutdown of Internet traffic to a critical infrastructure system. Well, see, that authority, as you think that through, would only be exercised when the person who owns or operates the system thinks that it ought not to be shut down. And they have strong incentive to protect their system. They have a strong incentive to isolate their system when it's in danger, and they do that right now. I think the question we have to ask is whether the government would have superior information that would inform that decision, and if so, that kind of information ought to be shared. And we ought to also ask other questions about what incentives that kind of authority would create. Would the owner-operator of that system be willing to share information that they ought to share when they know that that information could be used to shut them down? Would they be more hesitant to shut down on their own when they think they ought to because they're waiting to be ordered to shut down by the government, knowing that with the order will come a limitation of liability? So I think we have to think these things through and maybe game out some scenarios before we make blanket decisions.
Okay. Let me ask one other thing, and then I'll yield to the ranking member and others who may have questions. But as I understand what you've said, you think there is an appropriate role for government to share with private industry information it receives about signatures and malicious attacks going on in cyberspace, as long as it is the private entity that deals with it, that takes direct action of some sort.
Yes, yes.
And even though, obviously, if the government were to share some information with, say, a telecommunications carrier, the government will have to expect that some information is kept classified, potentially.
And the government should expect and should help the telecommunications carrier have people on staff who can handle classified information. Sure. And if there's a gap there, and the right ones don't have the right cleared people, that's a place where the committee ought to pay particular.
Well, DOD deals with defense contractors
all the time. Yeah.
All the time in huge numbers. So, yeah, I think that's a fair point. Ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To continue to explore this role of proper balance of authorities and such, particularly in time of crisis, and this is really for the entire panel. Do you think the DOD's role should be in specifically protecting not just our power systems, but other critical infrastructures, such as our financial institutions or communications sector? Should there be any new structures set up to increase their coordination with the Department of Homeland Security, for example?
I think there are some structures already, and again, when we think about role of DOD when it comes to securing private systems, it should be in a supportive role, and that, for example, it should be supporting the efforts of the Department of Homeland Security to work with those private entities to secure their systems. And Cyber Command and NSA are going to have information and expertise that will be useful. And the important thing is to loose it and to access it and to get it to DHS and to these other entities so they can do a better job.
I would answer that question. I think there is, I have seen evidence of good coordination between the Department of Defense and Homeland Security, but I'll repeat my earlier comment that working to try to resolve electric industry issues related to cyber, it's a community of agencies. It's not clear, where all the responsibilities lie and where the authorities are, but we try to work with everybody. I think there's an interesting set of questions here in terms of what DOD should be authorized to do in the state of an emergency. And I really wouldn't rule out, I sympathize with my fellow panelists' comment that it becomes very, very scary if a government agency can take an action that would alter the controls of the power grid, because it's just a scary thought. It could have unintended consequences. But I can conceive of extreme denial of a service attacks on the Internet, or sort of a major cyber concurrent attack on the entire country, where intervention by DOD might be beneficial just to stop the bleeding in the initial minutes and hours. And I think that would merit some more dialogue in terms of what that would look like. But overall, I think the industry needs the information to act under most circumstances.
I suggest that the DOD consider, again, threat models and try to work collaboratively in advance with providers of the key infrastructure, perhaps by giving them scenarios. So the DOD might suggest, for instance, that the electric grid have the capability to do a handful of things that would be useful to both the grid and the Defense Department if there were an attack on the grid. I think that kind of in advance preventive set of measures might be more effective than just having a blanket ability for the DOD to take over something that it's not used to running.
Let me turn to something else. There's a debate around, what constitutes cyber warfare, what constitutes a cyber attack, if you will, versus defense. And basically, how involved should our military be in cybersecurity? When you look at, for example, computer network operations by DOD, much of this debate focuses around, again, what constitutes warfare. Could you provide our definition, a definition to us about what cyber warfare is and what it looks like, and what the appropriate response should be?
Ranking Member Langevin, I've seen enough in the last few months, just my visits with Northcom and the Pentagon, to understand that the Department of Defense has a much richer understanding of the ongoing cyber warfare than we have in the private sector. So I think anything that can be done to not just keep that information internal as we know what's going on in the cyber warfare arena, but how can we help industry understand the information they need to know to be aware of what's going on. I myself have a top secret clearance, so I've been to some of the briefings and I've understood more than I had in the past, and it's serious stuff going on, and I think we need to be able to share that with industry in a timely fashion. The tendency is, because it's a war, to keep it inside the military and not share it, and I think we have to figure out how we overcome that a bit.
Anyone else? If not, I'll yield that.
Dr. Flieger, one of the challenges the government always faces is how to have a role that does not distort the market in some way. And I'm thinking about especially research in this area. Obviously, the Microsofts and the Dells of the world are doing lots of research about next phases of computing that can be more secure. Do you have suggestions as to the government's role in funding specific kinds of research that would be complementary but not displace the role that private industry plays?
I think there are already a lot of activities coordinating what the private sector is doing with what our universities should be doing and what the government should be sponsoring. And both within the DOD and the Department of Homeland Security, they have lists of their key topics that they try to fund. I think the place where there's room for improvement is that often the focus is on the technology alone and not on how people use the technology or perceive the technology. And so I think that's an opportunity for improving not just the kinds of technology that we're producing to make things more secure, but improving the technology transfer, improving the eagerness with which users view the security. If they could view it more as an enabler than as an obstacle, I think that would make a huge difference. It isn't always what the technologists like to get funded to look at, but in fact, technology that isn't used properly or isn't used at all is fairly worthless.
Let me also give you a chance to weigh in, if you would like, on this question about emergency powers, because I know it's been very controversial in some of the Senate bills about to what extent a government ought to have ability to take emergency actions, and you've heard a little bit of it addressed here. Do you have views on that?
I don't really have a view. I've looked at some of the issues, but I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a historian. I'm not sure it would be appropriate for me to make a judgment.
I appreciate it. Yeah, gentleman from Texas.
It occurred to me that as you're looking at this new cloud concept where everything's out that, are the things you were talking about today before that? In other words, all of that innovation which creates greater accesses and from anywhere you want, all your data is out there. The stuff we talked about today really contemplate that at all?
Do you mean, if I understand you, you're asking whether the kinds of recommendations that we made in our testimony might apply to cloud?
Actually, just the state of just the state of play, just the state of art. For does the users out there remotely understand the risks they take, and that you're relying on private entities to protect all of that? And it just occurred to me that we fight this fight right now, where most everybody's stuff was on a laptop and you had a direct access line, and but now with the new innovations and the continued improvements and everything, do we really contemplate? Are these recommendations getting as far ahead of that as what that is ahead of the normal way people understand what's going on?
Well, I think the cloud computing is a good example of misaligned incentives, because a lot of organizations are choosing to use the cloud because it's cheaper without being aware, as you point out, of the risks that they're taking. And so I think a lot of these questions are being raised, but there aren't a lot of good answers yet.
I think that it's a double-edged sword, and you could have cloud providers that are better at security than the individual user is on his or her laptop. So maybe if more users demand more security, we'll get better security as a result of the migration to the cloud instead of worse security.
But is the driver, is the free market system robust enough to drive those kinds of things without the users knowing it and or appreciating it to demand it?
I think it depends on the user. There are some users that are large corporations that are moving to the cloud, and they are asking these questions.
And so they'll drag along the protections for all those folks out there that don't have a clue.
They're going to drag along the protections obviously they're interested in protecting their own data. I think the issue is whether the practices become such that they become more standard at a higher level as a result of the demands of industry as it moves toward the cloud. They would filter down and help consumers.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that.
Let me just, I've been trying to take notes and see if I can summarize at least some areas where it seems to me y'all are pretty well in agreement. One is that the government does need to take some action, that continuing to let things drift along and that may be a little, continuing as we are without some additional action would be a mistake. Secondly, that there needs to be some further action in the form of incentives, regulations, to encourage a general, or to mandate a general increase in cybersecurity. Third, that at a minimum, the Department of Defense should ensure that the appropriate entities in the private sector have access to more of the information that the Department of Defense has in order to protect those private networks better. So does anybody disagree, I guess, with at least that starting point? And y'all have to say something. They can't.
I think that's a good starting point. I think that people are going to say, well, I didn't call for more regulation or this or that. But I think that when we look at incentives, we look at accessing information that the government has and spreading that out, I think that there is a general consensus about that.
And you're okay with increased incentives and considering at least looking at regulation of certain sectors that are already regulated, at least, as something to...
Yes, and as I said, we think that different sectors are going to be subject to different rules.
Yeah. And I should have clarified.
Mr. Chairman, I would generally agree as well with a couple of nuances. I think there does need to be clarity within the various agencies of the government in terms of roles and responsibilities and who do we work with as private sector. I think in terms of the mandates to industry, my sense is in the electric side, we've addressed that mostly through the existing structures through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and our ability to do mandatory standards. I did point out a gap. I thought an emergency, an immediate threat, do we need a mandate in action? I think there's a danger of further escalating the mandatory compliance directive aspect because we may drive the electric industry to sort of a common plateau of mandated regulations, and I'm trying to get them to fight the dynamic warfare in cyber. And so I think we can over-regulate when we have a solid foundation. So I just want to make that distinction. Thank you.
And that's a fair point and an important amplification, I think. Yes, ma'am.
I also agree that it's a good summary. I think, in addition, the government could, I think we'd probably all agree that the government could encourage private sector initiatives that already are good behavior. There already are examples of private enterprise making data public, collaborating in various ways, and so making that more visible and providing incentives in that way might be helpful.
Okay. We may want to pursue, I have some other questions on that line that we may want to pursue with you. Anyway, thank you all very much for being here. I appreciate your testimony and the time it took to prepare it and for your being here. With that, the hearing stands adjourned.